Beneath Ohio's quiet fields and river towns lies a record carved in bone, clay, and earth, evidence of people who watched the sky, measured the land, and carried stories across a continent. This isn't folklore. It's archaeology you can stand on. Every stop is real, excavated, dated, published. Some answers are solid, others are still forming. But together they reveal a simple truth. Ohio was never a blank space on an old map. It was a meeting ground of rivers, of nations, of ideas, and its past is still speaking if we know how to listen. If you enjoy evidence-based history told through real digs and real data, subscribe and hit the like button. And now we begin our story. If you drove past this spot in north central Ohio a century ago, you'd see cornfields and a low, unremarkable rise of dolomite. No cliff face, no yawning cavern mouth, just farmland and a sinkhole that locals barely noticed. What no one could see was the sealed chamber beneath, a natural vault packed with Ice Age bones and the rarest kind of human traces. Sheriden Cave wasn't open to the world for more than 10,000 years. When it finally was, the past came out in handfuls, mud-damp, cold, and undeniable. The cave sits on a karst ridge in Wyandotte County, not far from the town of Cary. In the late Pleistocene, a plug of glacial debris collapsed into its entrance and corked the system shut. That accident preserved a frozen moment. Animals that fell or were dragged in, twigs, seeds, and plant fibers. And, in the same strata, tools that could only have been made by people. It is one of the few places in eastern North America where a single deposit holds both late Ice Age ecology and unmistakable Paleo-Indian technology. Modern interest began almost by chance. In 1989, workers clearing the sinkhole for more tourist passages in the neighboring Indian Trail caverns exposed bone. Not farm bones. These were ancient and massive. Paleontologists and archaeologists moved in, and excavation turned the sinkhole into a deep, squared-off window into a buried world. Layer by layer, they mapped surfaces, bagged specimens, and followed a jumble of paw prints, gnaw marks, and hoof-shattered limestone into the dark. What they found reads like a roll call of vanished Ohio. There were bones of the giant beaver castoroids, rodents the size of a black bear with incisors like woodworking tools. There were the flat-headed peccary, herding pig relatives that haunted spruce parklands, long-nosed peccary, and the stag moose, Cervus scotti, a towering deer with broad, palmate antlers. The predators are there too, including the short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, a top carnivore of Pleistocene North America. This isn't a zoo list. It's a food web captured in collapse, each bone a clue about who lived, who hunted, and who scavenged in an Ohio that looked more like subarctic Canada. One early interpretation was blunt. Sheriden Cave was an animal trap. The sinkhole's steep sides could funnel panicked herds. Predators, following the wounded or finishing the fallen, left their own tracks and teeth behind. That reading fits the jumble of skeletons, the weathering patterns, and the way some carcasses came to rest. But it isn't the whole story, because people were there too, and their presence is carved into bone. Since the mid-1990s, excavators have recovered carefully shaped osseous tools, beveled bone rods, and projectile points fashioned from the long bones of large mammals. These aren't random splinters. They're straight, smooth, and finished to edges that look like the bevels on modern chisel tips. One of those bone points was directly radiocarbon dated to 10,915 plus or minus 30 years before present, placing a human hand at Sheriden Cave during the last breath of the Alarod warm phase, right before the sudden cold snap we call the Younger Dryas. In the same contexts, researchers reported a reworked, fluted Clovis point, an iconic stone tool of the first widespread North American culture. The human horizon is real, it is dated, and it sits shoulder to shoulder with Ice Age fauna. The site's preservation adds intimate details you don't usually get from open-air camps. Plant remains, tiny seeds, wood fragments, and bits of moss survived in the damp, sealed sediments. They sketch a landscape of spruce, sedge, and cold-adapted flora, a living map of what people saw and touched when they climbed the ridge. Not all the drama is human. One tally from the early 2000s fieldwork counted around 40 peccaries in the Sheriden Cave deposits. Think about that. A whole herd's worth of bones, some complete, some scattered, many chewed. that suggests repeated events, not a single disaster. The sinkhole did its work more than once, and each fall added another layer to the puzzle. To the excavators, the pattern meant hours of careful plotting, bagging, and labeling. To us, it means time depth, a place used and reused by animals, then by people moving through a bitter climate on the edge of change. Sheriden Cave also documents the messiness of survival. The bone rods may have been foreshafts, intermediate pieces that let hunters swap out broken tips without rebuilding an entire spear. Their beveled ends suggest a snug fit into socketed points, a modular design that makes sense for mobile groups tracking game across miles. The reworked fluted point tells a similar story. Tools were repaired and reused until they could work no more. In a world where meat, fat, and hide meant life, nothing was wasted. Not a bevel, not a sliver of good stone. Stand on that ridge now, and it's quiet. The plug that sealed the cave is long gone, and the field above looks ordinary again. But the artifacts and bones, carefully lifted, cleaned, and measured, still do their work. They give names to shadows, casteroids, servalces, Arctidus. They fix a date to a human hand, 10,915 plus or minus 30 radiocarbon years. They remind us that history in Ohio doesn't start with towns, roads, or survey lines. It starts with people reading tracks in wet snow, listening to ice groan, and learning to live at the edge of a new world. That's the memory Sheriden Cave kept for us, under the cornfields, waiting. From cavern quiet to floodlight urgency, our trail leads from Sheriden Cave to a 3-day salvage that changed what we know about Ohio's Ice Age. On a freezing December morning in 1989, a dragline operator widening a water hazard at the Burning Tree Golf Course in Heath, Ohio, felt his bucket grab onto something that wasn't mud. When the metal teeth came up, they were tangled with bone, thick, curved, and far too large for cattle. The bucket had hooked a skull. Within hours, phone calls pulled in archaeologists, paleontologists, volunteers, and anyone with a wool hat and a strong back. The excavation had to be fast. The bones were waterlogged, heavy as stone, and breaking down the moment they hit air. Teams from the Ohio Historical Society and the Licking County Archaeology and Landmarks Society mapped, lifted, wrapped, and carried. What began as a golf course chore became a salvage operation under floodlights, with generators humming and breath pluming in the dark. When they were done, the crew had pulled a nearly whole Mastodon, 90 to 95% complete, out of the pond edge. A life cut short at roughly 30 years of age, now laid out on tarps and plywood. The first surprise wasn't the size. It was the condition. The ribs and pelvis were intact. The tusks lay close to where the head had come to rest. Even fragile elements had survived. But down in the boggy sediment, the team also found something no one expected: compacted masses from the animal's gut, preserved like damp peat. Stomach and intestinal contents almost never survive, and certainly not from the late Ice Age in the Midwest. Here they did, sealed by the same cold, anoxic mud that had hidden the skeleton for more than 11,000 years. In the lab, the gut contents told a story in plants: sphagnum moss, sedges, water lilies, seeds, leaves, swamp grass. Before this, many researchers pictured mastodons as conifer browsers, pulling twigs and cones from spruce and fir. Burning Tree rewrote that image. This individual had been feeding in a wetland, tugging soft aquatic plants, food that ices over early, food you harvest by wading chest deep in cold water. That diet, together with the layer where the body lay, pointed to late fall or winter. A mastodon, in Ohio, eating the last green of the year. Then came the headline everyone remembers: microbiologists cultured living bacteria from the intestinal masses. Dozens of species revived from a gut that stopped working over 11,000 years ago. For a time, the Burning Tree cultures were presented as among the oldest living organisms ever isolated. Dating tightened the frame. What associated with the skeleton yielded radiocarbon ages around 11,450 to 11,660 years before present. Bone came in near 11,390 BP. In calendar years, that places the death of this animal near the very end of the Pleistocene, when ice sheets were retreating and the climate was swinging hard. Which leads to the most debated part of the find: marks on the ribs. Under magnification, Several rib fragments bear fine, V-shaped incisions with internal microstriations, classic signatures of stone blades slicing through fresh bone. The pattern doesn't look like rodent gnawing, carnivore scoring, or heavy trampling. It looks like butchery. Fisher, Lepper, and colleagues argued that the carcass was disarticulated and the meat stored, possibly packed in the same cold bog that preserved the gut. It's a hunter's trick as old as winter. Let the ground be your ice house. But there's a catch. No tools turned up in the salvage. No flakes, no points, no scrapers. Nothing you could hold up and say, "This did it." That gap keeps the debate alive. Some suggest the tools simply weren't recovered in the rush, or they fell beyond the excavation window. Others caution that certain natural processes can mimic cut marks, and that extraordinary claims need thick layers of proof. Beyond the arguments, there's the craft of the salvage itself. Picture crews moving from unit to unit, finding vertebrae still chained in order, easing tusks from black mud, cribbing fragile elements with wood and plaster. The animal's right rear leg was missing. A handful of tailbones had wandered. 2 ribs were gone. Toe bones never turned up. Gaps that tell their own story about decay, scavenging, and water flow. Yet compared to most Ice Age finds, this skeleton is a revelation in completeness. And the biography kept moving. In 1993, the original skeleton was sold at auction for more than $600,000 and shipped overseas. Today it resides in a museum in Japan. The sale upset some Ohioans. How could a state treasure leave? But it also ensured the fossil's conservation and public display, while casts and research materials stayed in American institutions. What does Burning Tree change? It anchors mastodons in wetlands and winter diets, proving flexibility when the old world was freezing and thawing in pulses. It offers a rare look at Ice Age microbiology, literal gut feelings from a vanished species. It gives us a radiocarbon-type point on the timeline, near the moment when megafauna blink out in Ohio. Burning Tree does not solve the Pleistocene. It does something better. It lets us see one animal's last season with uncommon clarity and asks us to think like field workers. Follow the marks, read the plants, respect the mud, and admit what we don't yet know. That's how a golf course turned into a laboratory, and how a mastodon became a question that will not go away. We leave the frozen pond at Burning Tree and head to a quiet river terrace. Drive the Scioto River north from Portsmouth and the land lifts into quiet terraces, corn, pasture, a few farm lanes. 2,000 years ago, one of those terraces held a ceremonial complex the size of a football field and a mound unlike any other. Locals long knew the rise as Tremper Mound. In 1915, when archaeologist William C. Mills opened it with square shovels and string lines, he didn't just find a burial place. He uncovered a building's ghost. Rows of post holes tracing runes and corridors on a packed clay floor. A charnel house sealed beneath tons of earth. On that floor, in a single chamber, lay a ritual deposit that would change the story of the Hopewell world. Mills and his crew lifted more than 500 objects from that room. The centerpiece was a great cache of 136 stone pipes, platform pipes, their bowls perched above flat bases, some plain and some carved as living creatures. 60 or so were effigies, hawks and cranes with folded wings, owls with heavy brows, turtles and otters, wolves and bears mid-prowl. All had been purposely broken before burial, as if the act of ending the object's useful lives completed the rite. A century later, conservators had restored 106 of them. One proved to be limestone, the rest some form of pipestone. The cache is still one of the most striking ritual hoards ever found in the eastern woodlands. If the pipes dazzle, the context matters just as much. The cache wasn't tossed in randomly. It lay on the floor of the building that the mound covered, in a deliberate deposit. Around it, Mills mapped features you can still read in his plan: room outlines, burial bays, depositories, even cremation areas. The impression is unmistakable. This was architecture in earth and timber, a place built for ceremony, used for a time, then closed with care. The mound wasn't a heap of dirt over bones. It was a capstone over a story told in wood, clay, and stone. For decades, everyone assumed they knew what the pipes were made of. Across the river lay Furt Hill, an outcrop of Ohio pipestone, a soft, workable flint clay. It seemed obvious that Tremper's artisans quarried locally and carved locally. Then a team of geologists and archaeologists tested 111 of the Tremper pipes with mineral spectroscopy. The results overturned a century of certainty. Less than 20% were Ohio stone. Roughly 65% came from a unique flint clay in northern Illinois. About 18% were true catlinite from quarries in what is now southwestern Minnesota. In other words, the raw material for Tremper's most sacred objects crossed hundreds of miles before it ever saw a Scioto workbench. That sourcing result does two things to your mental map. First, it widens Hopewell from a local culture into a far-flung network. People moving ideas and materials along rivers and portages from the upper Mississippi to southern Ohio. Second, it reframes the cache itself. These weren't casual smokers knocked together from whatever lay underfoot. The artisans chose distant clay on purpose, the way a cathedral builder orders specific stone. The material carried meaning. The journey itself may have been part of the object's power. The artistry is intimate. Many effigies are lifelike enough that ornithologists can pick out genera: herons with dagger bills, cranes with long crowns, raptors with hooked beaks. Feathers and fur are rendered with shallow cuts. Eyelids and nostrils show careful tooling. Even posture matters: a crouch, a tilt, a bird's weight shifted to 1 foot. This isn't mass production. It's portraiture in stone, each animal chosen for a reason listeners at the time would have understood instantly. A pipe is a tool for smoke, yes, but here it's also a speaker, a clan sign, a prayer. Mills noticed something else. The cache echoes an earlier discovery upriver at Mound City, where 19th century diggers turned up a smaller group of animal pipes. By 1915, Tremper proved that wasn't a one-off curiosity. It was a pattern: pipes, animals, ceremony, repeated across the Scioto Valley, linking sites in a shared language of ritual. Today, parts of the Tremper cache are on view in Columbus. Others rest in storage, studied and restudied as new techniques ask new questions of old stone. Why break them? That's the question visitors always ask. At Tremper, the sheer number suggests a gathering big enough to draw people from far outside the Scioto Basin, each delegation bringing its emblem, using it, then breaking it, and laying it down on the same floor. For a few days or weeks, the charnel house must have been loud with voices and song. Then it fell quiet, its doors sealed under fresh earth. The mound's shape adds a layer of intrigue. Early surveyors thought the earthwork outline suggested an animal, an effigy stretched along the terrace. Whether that reading holds or not, the site fits a broader Hopewell habit of tying story to landscape. Enclosures keyed to river bends, alignments to sun and moon, architecture that turns the ground itself into a ceremonial instrument. Tremper sits 5 miles north of the Ohio-Scioto confluence, on a high, level platform above the floodplain, the kind of stage you pick when the sky is part of the performance. Stand in front of the cases today, and the pipes feel less like artifacts and more like introductions. Owl, crane, turtle, wolf, each the face of a community. Mineral tests give them home addresses: Illinois clay, Minnesota catlinite, some Ohio stone. The map that emerges is not empire, not trade for profit, but obligation, kin ties, pilgrimages, reciprocal gifts carried by canoe and on foot. The cache records that web in a way texts never could. Each pipe is a line on the map, each break a signature that says, "We came, we witnessed, we leave this here." A century after Mills, Tremper is still arguing its point. To some, the cache proves the Scioto Valley was a hub in a continental ceremony, where materials and myths converged, were transformed, and were sent back out as memory. To others, the emphasis falls on the building, a real architectural plan beneath the mound, showing that Hopewell ritual wasn't just processions around embankments but rooms, thresholds, and a choreography under a roof. Either way, Tremper pulls us past the old cliches of mound builders and toward people with names, clans, calendars, and art. That's the power of a floor full of broken pipes. It makes a vanished gathering feel present. In that layered grammar, Tremper speaks plainly. The Hopewell world was wide. Its art traveled. Its ceremonies were built and then buried. And on a river terrace in southern Ohio, the memory of one such gathering still waits where the pipes were left, silent, purposeful, unforgettable. We leave the quiet floor at Tremper, its effigy pipes broken, blessed, and buried, and step into a wider map. Follow the black sheen in the soil, volcanic glass from the far west. On a summer dig along the Scioto, an intern lifted a sliver of black stone from the sift and did a double take. It looked wrong for Ohio, too glassy, too dark, too clean at the break. A field supervisor took it, turned it in the light, and nodded. Not chert, not smoky quartz. Glass. Volcanic glass. In a state with no volcanoes, that little flake was either a prank or a message from very far away. Obsidian breaks like lightning freezes. A single crack races through the stone, leaving silky, scalloped curves called conchoidal fractures. The edges are so sharp they can rival surgical steel. In the Hopewell country around Chillicothe, Mound City, Sipe, Hopeton, excavators have found that black sheen in caches, in construction fill, and on the floors of timber buildings buried under mounds. Not much of it, just enough to be unmistakable. It is an immigrant material in a landscape of local flints. How do you prove where a shard came from? You read its chemistry. Each obsidian flow carries a unique cocktail of trace elements, parts per million of rubidium, zirconium, niobium, strontium, and other geochemical spice. In the lab, a beam of energy, X-ray fluorescence, or neutron activation coaxes those elements to speak. The pattern is a fingerprint. Match the pattern to a quarry, and you've traced a route across the continent. Ohio's fingerprints point west, far west. Some pieces match obsidian cliff inside today's Yellowstone National Park, a high shelf of cooled lava above a valley of hot springs and lodgepole pine. Others match sources in Idaho's volcanic fields. From those mountains to the Scioto Valley is more than 1,500 miles as the crow flies. As a river journey, it's longer still. Down the Yellowstone to the Missouri, into the Mississippi, up the Ohio, then into the Scioto, a stitched river road of canoe wakes and portages. The context in Ohio isn't random. Much of the glass comes from Hopewell's ceremonial centers, walled earthworks with perfect circles and squares, timber hulls built and burned, floors buried under caps of clay. Alongside obsidian lie other strangers: copper from the Lake Superior shores, mica from the southern Appalachians, marine shells from the Gulf, grizzly bear teeth from the Rockies. Archaeologists call this web the Hopewell interaction sphere, not an empire, but a network of obligations, visits, and gifts that moved sacred materials across half a continent. What did the Hopewell do with distant glass? Some fragments are prismatic blades and bladelets, snapped from carefully prepared cores. A few are knife-sized bifaces, thin as crackers and dangerously sharp. Under a microscope, some edges carry the polish and microchipping that come from cutting hide or plant fibers. Others look unused, as if they served a life of display rather than work. Either way, the setting is rarely the garbage pit of daily living. It's the clean floor of a special building, a cache beneath a post, a deposit by a doorway, intentional placements inside ritual architecture. The quantities are small enough to make every piece feel special, but not so rare that we're dealing with one traveler's souvenir. That balance matters. If obsidian were a rumor, you'd expect a single flake here or there. Instead, you get consistent whispers at multiple major sites, enough to say the material was known, respected, and expected at ceremonies. It's not currency, it's presence. A blade laid down in a mound is a hand extended across distance, saying, "Our story reaches the mountains." There's a practical side to the romance. Obsidian's sharpness is unmatched, but it is brittle. In a world where local flints and hornstones make excellent durable tools, volcanic glass is overkill for everyday butchery. That tension, extreme sharpness versus fragility, makes sense in ritual contexts: cutting cordage for a robe, trimming feathers, opening a bundle, or performing acts that matter as symbol as much as function. In many traditions, the tool you choose is part of the prayer. A black glass blade from the far horizon changes the weight of a gesture. Follow the route back in your head. Someone stood below obsidian cliff where a lava flow cooled into glass and quarried a core. Someone packed that core with food, hides, and stories into a canoe. The cargo moved from band to band, camp to camp, each exchange adding a layer of meaning. Rivers were highways. The Yellowstone's clear water, the big brown Missouri turning east, the Mississippi shouldering south, the Ohio sliding through wooded hills. Where the current failed, people carried boats and bundles overland. No draft animals, no wheels, just backs, dogs, songs, and the patient arithmetic of reciprocity. We don't have travel diaries, but we do have patterns. The same places that yield obsidian yield non-local copper, shell, mica, and grizzly teeth. The same buildings that shelter obsidian shards also hosted feasts and fires that ended with deliberate burning. In the Scioto country, earthworks key to the paths of sun and moon-framed gatherings where delegations could arrive under a known sky and know where to stand. The materials they brought were not simply raw stuff. They were condensed relationships. There are cautions. Down the line exchange, one group passing goods to the next, can move objects far without a single Scioto pilgrim seeing Yellowstone. Some objects may have made parts of the trip as gifts in motion, circulating for years before finding a final home in a mound. And the obsidian record is thinner than copper or shell. That thinness is its own lesson. This wasn't a flood of trade goods. It was a trickle with focus. To modern eyes, the striking thing is precision without letters. Nobody wrote a receipt. Yet communities hundreds of miles apart agreed on the meanings of materials and the choreography of ceremonies. They synced the building of timber halls and the timing of feasts with lunar cycles. They engineered earthworks the size of small towns and sighted avenues to the horizon. Into that order, a few ounces of midnight glass traveled from a fireborn cliff and took their places beside copper crescents and carved pipes. A continent feels smaller when you see it that way, not as empty wilderness, but as a conversation. Stand in a museum case glow and find one of those Ohio obsidian blades. It is no bigger than your palm, thin enough to be dangerous, glossy as still water. The label might list Yellowstone or Idaho as a source, and you'll feel the distance like a taut string. But the more important distance isn't miles. It's the span between two kinds of knowing. On one side, the lab's instrument hums and graphs flicker with peaks and troughs, a signature copied from a western cliff. On the other, a stonecutter thousands of years ago lifts the core, pressures the platform, and watches a flawless blade run free. The science names the place. The craft reminds you why the journey was worth it. In the end, Yellowstone glass in Ohio is not a headline about exotic imports. It is evidence that the Midwest sat at the center of a wide world. People here didn't just look up at careful skies. They looked out along rivers and saw allies, partners, and paths. Obsidian is proof, hard and bright, that the Hopewell world was not small. It reached for the mountains, and the mountains reached back, one blade at a time. Yellowstone glass proved that Ohio's story reaches far beyond its rivers. But some connections weren't carried by hand. They were drawn into the earth. Ahead lies High Bank Works, a circle and an octagon tuned to the moon. Follow the Scioto south through Chillicothe, and the land opens into broad river flats cut by old channels and low terraces. 2,000 years ago, one terrace held a piece of geometry so crisp you can still draw it in the air with your finger, a nearly perfect circle joined to a broad octagon, each enclosure about the size of several football fields, their earthen walls once shoulder-high and cleanly banked. This is High Bank Works. Stand there at dawn and you can feel the ground doing math. Angles, arcs, long sight lines. Like the valley itself was drafted with a measuring cord. High Bank's circle and octagon pairing has a twin across the state at Newark, the famous Great Circle and Octagon earthworks. Those two sites are the only places in North America where a circle and an octagon are conjoined at this grand scale. The resemblance is not casual. Both octagons are roughly the same size. Both linked to a circular enclosure by a short, walled neck. Both integrate broad, level interiors suited for gatherings, processions, and the controlled movement of people. And both, crucially, appear to key parts of their design to events in the sky, especially the slow, 6-year swing of the moon's extreme rising points on the horizon. At Newark, the octagon's axis famously targets the northern lunar standstill, a rare position the moon reaches only twice in a human generation. At High Bank, the fit is not a carbon copy, but the geometry rhymes. The octagon's cross lines echo lunar extremes, and the principal axes of High Bank and Newark sit at a striking right angle to one another. Imagine two great instruments tuned to the same cycle, set 90 degrees apart across the Ohio country. That's not a coincidence, you shrug away. How do we know? Because the Earth remembers in stains and shadows. 19th century surveyors mapped High Bank's walls when they still stood crisp. Modern archaeologists have added magnetometry, drone photography, and careful test trenches. The result is a layered portrait. Broad earthen embankments enclosing clean interior floors, entrances set in measured gaps, and long, straight wall segments that behave less like fortifications and more like rulers laid on the land. If you're looking for a battlefield, you won't find one. There are too many gates. If you're looking for a stage, you're standing on it. Now draw a mental line between the two octagons. Newark sits in the Licking River Basin to the northeast. High Bank overlooks the confluence of the Scioto and the Paint Creek to the south-central. On old maps and in scattered farm reports, archaeologists notice something along that line. Pairs of low, parallel embankments trending southwest away from Newark, spaced a couple hundred feet apart, running straight over ridge after ridge as if indifferent to the hills. Aerial photographs taken when crops and light were just right picked up more traces. The pieces never added up to a visible highway, but they kept pointing in the same direction, toward the Scioto heartland. That observation grew into an audacious idea, the Great Hopewell Road. The hypothesis holds that 2,000 years ago a long, straight, processional avenue, flanked by modest earthen walls, linked Newark to the Scioto Valley ceremonial centers, perhaps specifically to High Bank and its sister earthworks nearby. Not a road for carts or draft animals, there were none, but a marked way for pilgrims on foot, a corridor that turned a multi-day journey into ceremony. Move within the walls, and you walked inside the story. Leave the corridor, and you left the rite. Skeptics are right to demand proof. Ohio's plows have shaved the land for 2 centuries. Most low earthworks vanished into field edges and fence rows. Excavation windows are small, land access is uneven, and straight lines invite human imagination to connect dots that may not belong together. Yet short remnants of parallel embankments near Newark have been excavated and measured. Early accounts describe them clearly. Their bearing, again and again, leans southwest toward the Scioto. If this is coincidence, it's an oddly consistent one. What would a road like that do? It would bind the Hopewell world. Newark's octagon is keyed to a rare lunar extreme. High Bank's geometry answers it like a harmony line. The corridor between them would give that shared sky a shared ground. Picture delegations departing Newark during a standstill season, walking between low walls that made the land itself a hallway. Along the way, small mounds or way stations might mark camping places, offerings, or turning points. When the procession reached the Scioto, the earthworks there, High Bank, Hopeton, Sipe, Mound City, the Great Hopewell Mound Group, would receive walkers already tuned by the journey's order. Inside High Bank, that order mattered. The octagon's 8 long faces are not arbitrary. They shape how crowds move, how lines form, how vistas open and close as you pass through gates. If you plant posts or small mounds at certain corners or gaps, you can time a procession by the sun or moon, letting light strike a marker at the moment a rite requires. We see versions of that choreography elsewhere in the valley. Timber circles burned and buried after intense use, posts reset over generations, floors cleaned and capped. The earthworks are not just shapes. They are instruments that produce reliable moments. Nothing about this requires kings or standing armies. The people who built and used High Bank had other priorities: farming, river travel, kin networks. They gathered when cycles and obligations called, bringing materials and memories from far away. Copper from Lake Superior, mica from the southern mountains, obsidian blades in small numbers from Yellowstone's volcanic fields. Within that network, building a road wasn't an act of conquest. It was an act of coordination. The line mattered because it reminded walkers where they were headed and why. There is humility in how the story is told today. Archaeologists do not claim a 60-mile boulevard paved in clay. They do claim evidence of segments, a strong directional logic, and a set of earthworks at either end whose design kinship is too tight to ignore. They also admit how much has been lost. High Bank itself survived by luck. Part of it lies quiet inside a protected unit, study by permission, the walls now low swells under grass. Newark's octagon almost disappeared under a century of fairways and fences before preservationists and tribal nations fought to keep it legible. Even when the walls fade, the plan holds. Put the maps side by side, and the connection still hums. So what do you do with a missing avenue? You treat it like a question worth walking. You stand at High Bank's entrance gap and imagine a line of people rising over the last ridge, moving between low banks at a measured pace, carrying bundles and songs whose verses only make sense at the octagon's edge. You go to Newark when the moon rises furthest north and watch it ride along the octagon's axis like a silver bead on a wire. You hold both ends in your mind at once, the twin octagons and the corridor that may have joined them, and you let the Ohio Valley feel small in the way a pilgrimage makes a continent small. In the end, the Great Hopewell Road is not just a claim about dirt, it's a claim about intention. High Bank and Newark say the same thing in different keys. The sky matters, the measure matters, and the path between sacred places matters. Whether the road survives in long stretches under pasture or only in stubborn fragments and old notes, the idea it encodes is clear. 2,000 years ago, people here built with earth to keep time with the heavens, and they may have stitched their temples together with a straight line you could walk. We leave the geometry of earthworks for a different kind of construction, one made in 1860. Welcome to the Newark Holy Stones. The story begins in the summer and fall of 1860, when Newark, Ohio surveyor David Wyrick cut into ancient earth near the Hopewell earthworks and pulled out something no one expected from a Midwestern mound: stones carved with Hebrew. The first, nicknamed the Keystone for its tapered shape, carried 4 short phrases: Holy of Holies, King of the Earth, the Law of God, and the Word of the Lord. A few months later, Wyrick's crew opened a sandstone box inside a mound south of Newark and found a small black tablet covered, front to back, with a condensed 10 Commandments and a robed figure labeled Moses. A teacup-sized stone bowl lay nearby. Newspapers lit up. If real, the Newark Holy Stones would rewrite American prehistory overnight. Even in 1860, the find split the room. Ministers and antiquarians argued about lost tribes and the origins of the mound builders. Skeptics pointed to the stones themselves. The Keystone's letters looked like the tidy bookhand of printed Hebrew, and worse, someone had carved them left or right, the direction you'd use if you didn't actually read Hebrew. The longer Decalogue tablet tried to look older by switching alphabets, but scholars have since shown that its text includes telltale copying mistakes that only make sense if a forger was transposing from a modern Hebrew Bible into a made-up, ancient script. In 1991-94, Jeff Gill and archaeologist Brad Lepper asked Harvard's famed Semiticist Frank Moore Cross to review a specific spelling blunder. He agreed it betrayed a modern source. The case for fraud hardened. Motives? Look at the year. In 1860, the nation hovered on the edge of civil war, and Americans were fighting with science as well as bullets. One hot debate pitted monogenists, a single human origin, against polygynists, separate creations for different races. A dramatic Hebrew relic from an American mound promised moral leverage. Proof, some hoped, that Indians and Israelites shared a story, one human family. That doesn't make forgery right, but it explains why someone might have tried to plant a past they believed ought to exist. The Johnson Hummerhouse Museum, which still exhibits the stones, puts that social context front and center. The stones themselves are theatrical. The Decalogue stone is black limestone, shaped like a little tombstone with a grip at the bottom. Its sandstone box fits it like a glove. The text scrolls around the sides and back, circling to its start. The keystone is smooth and palm-sized, each of its 4 faces carrying a short pious phrase. None of this is typical of Hopewell artifacts from the mounds where they were said to appear, which otherwise yield pipes, copper, mica, and finely made stone tools, not Hebrew scriptures. Today, you can stand inches from the holy stones at the Johnson Hummerhouse Museum in Coshocton and see that mismatch for yourself. By the late 20th century, the scholarly verdict was blunt: forgery. Lepper and Gill not only tracked the inscription errors, they also found a likely inspiration for the Decalogue tablet's overall shape in an illustration from Austin Henry Layard's 1853 book on Assyrian discoveries, a convenient design source available in Ohio well before 1860. You don't need a lab to see the family resemblance. Pair that with the linguistic slips, and the holy stones stop looking ancient and start looking 19th century clever. If the why is legible, the who remains slippery. Weyrich supporters point to his bumbling woodcut copies of the Hebrew, full of errors, as proof he didn't carve the originals. Others note that he was part of Newark's tight network of surveyors, clergy, and artisans. Exactly the set of people who could have manufactured props for a grand argument about America's past. After Weyrich's death in 1864, more Hebrew stones surfaced nearby and were quickly confessed as pranks by a local dentist, showing how easy it was to seed doubts or sights. But for the two core pieces, proof of the actual hand that carved them never turned up. What we have is context, pattern, and the stone's own mistakes. Here are the 5 facts that land hardest. Fact 1. 2 finds, 5 objects. The Newark Holy Stones set includes the keystone, the Decalogue tablet, its fitted sandstone box, a small stone bowl recovered with the Decalogue, and in the wider, now lost constellation, later Newark Hebrew stones exposed as fakes. Fact 2. Display today. The keystone, the Decalogue, the box, and the bowl are on exhibit at the Johnson Humrickhouse Museum, where staff present both the artifacts and the forgery debate, rather than hiding them. Fact 3. Linguistic tells. Carving direction errors on the keystone and specific letter substitution mistakes on the Decalogue align with modern Hebrew models rather than ancient usage. Cross's expert review backed that conclusion. Fact 4. A printed pattern. The Decalogue tablets form parallels steely pictured in mid-century popular books about the ancient Near East, handy templates that a 19th century forger could copy. Fact 5. Media afterlife. Despite the evidence, the stones keep resurfacing in museums, on TV, and across the internet because they plug into enduring stories about the mound builders, the Bible, and national identity. That persistence is part of their history. So why keep them on view? Because they're not just about a hoax. They're about how Americans make meaning from the past. In 1860, the Holy Stones offered comfort to some, confirmation to others, and a target for skeptics. In 2025, they offer a teaching moment. Visitors can see the objects, learn the Hopewell context they don't fit, and walk through the reasoning that unmasks them. It's a rare exhibit that lets you watch the tools of skepticism at work: epigraphy, provenience, historical sourcing, and the humility to admit when a beautiful story doesn't hold up. The Decalogue's tiny Moses is still there, turbaned and serene. The Hebrew still gleams under glass. Across the room, a label explains the earthworks where the stones were supposedly found, real achievements of real indigenous engineers. That juxtaposition is the point. The Holy Stones helped invent a fantasy America wanted in 1860. The Newark earthworks tell us who actually lived here 2,000 years before that. In the distance between those two truths, you can hear the hard work of history.